They think I'm just a senile 70-year-old architect, a relic of the past waiting to die. My son, Mads, and his model wife just gave me 48 hours to disappear from my home, using a forged signature they made while I was in Greenland.
But they aren't just stealing my house. They've already taken out an €8 million insurance policy on my life, planning to drug me to death in a dark warehouse in the Faroe Islands just to pay off their gambling debts to a Swedish gang. What they don't know is that I'm sitting on a secret worth €120 million. I didn't call the police, not yet. Instead, I did something much worse. I bought their debt. I don't just want them in prison, I want to own them before I destroy them. My name is Lucas Jensen, and this is how I became my son's executioner. The silence that followed Mads's voice on the phone was heavier than any silence I had ever known. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a house at rest, it was the suffocating stillness of a tomb. I sat at my wooden desk, the phone still pressed to my ear long after the line had gone dead. He had sounded so reasonable, so practiced in his concern. It was the voice of a man who had already buried me in his mind. I looked down at the documents Fraser had left behind. The paper felt oily between my fingers, tainted by the lies printed on it. My son. The person I had taught to ride a bike along the Aarhus canals, the boy I had sat with through 100 scraped knees, was now telling me that my mind was rotting. He wasn't just stealing my house, he was stealing my reality. I took a deep breath, the cold air of the room stinging my lungs. I needed to think. I needed to be the man who solved problems with logic and precision, not the man who was currently trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Habit is a strange thing. Even when your world is collapsing, you still want a cup of tea. As I waited for the water to boil, my eyes drifted to the stove. It was a high-end gas model, a gift from Mads 2 years ago. My mind flashed back to the incident he had mentioned on the phone. It had happened 3 weeks after I returned from my trip. I had been out in the garden shed, sorting through old tools when I smelled it, the faint, sickly sweet scent of unburnt gas. I had rushed inside to find 2 of the burners turned to full, the igniters clicking uselessly but no flame. At the time, I had been shaken. I had blamed myself, thinking I must have bumped them while cleaning. Mads had arrived shortly after, curiously early for a Tuesday, and had been horrified. He had held my shoulders, looking into my eyes with a mask of pity, and told me that maybe I was getting tired. He had used that single moment to plant a seed of doubt that he was now trying to harvest. "You didn't bump them, Lucas," I whispered to the empty kitchen. The realization was a physical blow. Mads had been in the house that day. He had offered to drop off some groceries. He must have turned the dials when I was in the shed, waiting for me to find them so he could begin the narrative of my decline. It was a calculated, cruel piece of theater. I took my tea back to the study. I'd needed facts. I reached into the middle drawer and pulled out a heavy magnifying glass with a brass handle. I spread the power of attorney document under the lamp and began to examine it with the same scrutiny I used to apply to complex technical drawings. I ignored the signature for a moment and focused on the date, December 12th. The document claimed I had signed it in the presence of Søren Moller, right here in Aarhus. I stood up and went to the bookshelf, pulling down my leather-bound travel journal. I flipped through the pages until I found the entries for December. My pulse quickened. From December 5th to December 23rd, I wasn't even in Denmark. I had been on a solo expedition to the Ilulissat ice fjord in Greenland, a place where the icebergs are the size of skyscrapers and the silence is absolute. I found the entry for the 12th. I had spent the day on a small red fishing boat with a local guide named Malik. We were miles away from any cell tower, surrounded by nothing but deep blue water and ancient ice. I had paid Malik in cash for the extra fuel, but I had the satellite phone logs and the flight receipts from Air Greenland. I sat back, a grim sort of satisfaction settling over me. They had been sloppy. They had assumed an old man wouldn't keep records, that he wouldn't have the presence of mind to check his own calendar. I was thousands of miles away on the day they claimed I handed over my life. But as the adrenaline faded, a new thought crept in. If they were this desperate to take the house, what else had they touched? I opened my laptop and logged into my primary savings account. This was my safe money, the 75,000 euros I had set aside from my pension over the years. It was meant to be my insurance, the fund that would pay for any medical needs or travel I wanted to do in my final years. The screen flickered to life. I stared at the balance. €. I clicked on the transaction history. The entire amount had been moved 2 days ago via a wire. Transfer. The recipient wasn't a care facility. The money had been moved to an account labeled MJ Holdings, Mads's personal investment vehicle. He hadn't just put a deposit down on a room for me. He had gutted me. The room felt like it was closing in. 75,000 euros might be a small sum to some, but to me it represented a decade of careful living. It was the fruit of my labor, and Mads had taken it as if it were his by right. I closed the laptop and leaned my head back against the chair. My son thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, and he thought I was a pawn. He didn't realize that I knew the board better than he ever would. I picked up the phone again. I had more than enough evidence to go to the police right now. The forgery was obvious once you knew where to look. The theft of the funds was documented. I could have Mads in handcuffs by dinner time, but something stopped me. A cold, dark curiosity. Why now? Why the rush to sell the house? Why the elaborate lie about my mental health? A man doesn't destroy his relationship with his only living parent for 75,000 euros and a suburban villa unless his back is against the wall. I needed to know the depth of the hole they were in. I called Elias Holm in Copenhagen. Elias was more than just a money manager. He was an old friend of the family, a man who understood the value of discretion. "Lucas," Elias said, his voice warm but professional, "I've started the audit you asked for. It's not good." "Tell me," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "Your son's firm is a shell, Lucas. He's been taking massive risks with client money, mostly in high-leverage crypto positions. It looks like he lost a significant amount of capital 3 months ago." But that's not the worst of it. I waited, my hand tightening on the arm of the chair. "He's borrowed money from some very unpleasant people in Malmö," Elias continued, "private lenders. The kind who don't use lawyers to collect. The debt is 4 million euros, and it's past due. They've been putting pressure on him, and by extension, on Freya. 4 million, I repeated. The number was staggering. It explained the desperation. It explained the exclusive care home. They weren't just trying to move me out. They were trying to liquidate me. "There's one more thing, Lucas," Elias said, his tone dropping an octave. "I did a sweep of recent filings. A life insurance policy was taken out in your name 6 weeks ago. The payout is 8 million euros in the event of accidental death. The beneficiaries are Mads and Fraser Jensen. The heir left the room. An accidental death, like a forgotten stove, or a fall, or a misplaced dose of medication in a remote care facility. Elias," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, "I want you to find out who holds that debt in Malmö. I want the names of the lenders, the exact terms of the agreement, and the current payoff amount. Lucas, what are you planning?" "I'm not planning anything yet, Elias. I'm just looking at the structure of the situation." Every structure has a load-bearing point. If you hit it hard enough, the whole thing comes down. I hung up and walked over to the window. The sun was setting, painting the Aarhus skyline in shades of bruised purple and orange. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I didn't see a confused old man. I saw someone who had spent his life making sure things were built to last, and someone who knew exactly how to dismantle something that was rotten to the core. They had given me 48 hours. They thought that was enough time to break me. What they didn't realize was that 48 hours is an eternity when you have nothing left to lose and 120 million euros to use as a hammer. I went to the kitchen and poured the cold tea down the sink. I didn't need a drink. I didn't need to rest. I had work to do. I had to prepare for the visit to Mads's apartment. I had to play the part of the broken father, the man who was ready to surrender. I had to get inside their circle so I could see the rot for myself. As I walked back to my workshop to pack my small bag, I passed the pendulum clock. It was still ticking, steady and rhythmic. Tick, tick. The countdown hadn't started when they arrived on my porch. It had started the moment they decided I was worth more dead than alive. And unlike them, I was very good with timing. The walk from my car to the entrance of the high-rise apartment complex felt longer than the trip from Aarhus. I carried 2 heavy, leather-bound photo albums against my chest, their weight a physical anchor. These were Astrid's albums, the chronicles of a life built on trust, laughter, and a kind of quiet devotion that my son clearly hadn't inherited. Using them as a Trojan horse felt like a betrayal of her memory, but I had no other choice. To beat them, I had to become the man they thought I was. A broken, confused old soul clinging to the wreckage of his past. The lobby was a temple of glass and polished stone, smelling of expensive lilies and desperation. I caught my reflection in the mirrored elevator doors. I had intentionally worn an old, slightly oversized cardigan and let my hair remain uncombed. I made sure my shoulders slumped. I wanted them to see a man who had already surrendered. When the elevator hissed open on the 22nd floor, Freya was already standing at the door of their unit, looking at her watch. "You're late, Lucas," she said, not moving to let me in. She was wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my workshop tools. "Mads is in a meeting. This really isn't a good time. I found these," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I held out the albums. I made sure my hands shook just enough to be noticeable. "I can't take them where I'm going. I thought Mads should have them. For the kids. If there ever are any." The mention of children made her expression flicker with something like disgust. But her eyes landed on the gold-embossed leather. She reached out and took them, her greed winning over her annoyance. "Fine, come in, but only for a minute." The apartment was a museum of bad taste and borrowed money. Every surface was covered in high-end gadgets and designer furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. I followed her into the sprawling living area. My eyes were already scanning the layout. I needed 2 locations. The office where Mads did his investing, and somewhere they would feel safe enough to speak the truth. I think I need some water, Freya." "The drive was quite taxing," I murmured, sinking into a chair that felt like it was made of plastic and ego. She sighed, a sharp, theatrical sound. "Wait here." The moment she turned toward the kitchen, I moved. I didn't move like a 70-year-old with a failing mind. I moved with the silent, efficient grace of a man who had spent 40 years fine-tuning delicate machinery. I stepped into the hallway and slipped into Mads's home office. It was a room filled with monitors and a desk that was far too large for the man who sat behind it. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a device the size of a shirt button. It was a high-frequency transmitter with a sticky backing. I reached under the mahogany desk, feeling for the grain of the wood, and pressed it firmly into the corner where the leg met the top. It was invisible to anyone not looking for it. I was back in the living room chair before the ice had even clinked in Fraser's glass. "Here," she said, handing me a glass of lukewarm water. "Mads will be out in a second, then you really need to go. We have a lot of arrangements to make for your move on Wednesday." "Of course," I said, taking a small sip. "The move. It's all very fast." Mads appeared a moment later, looking frazzled. He was rubbing his temples, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. When he saw me, he forced a smile that didn't even reach his cheeks. "Dad, glad you could make it," he said, his voice tight. "I was just telling Fraser." "I'm a bit overwhelmed," I said, letting the glass slip slightly in my hand. "My stomach. Could I use the washroom, Mads? I think the stress is getting to me." Mads looked at Fraser. She gave a curt nod. "Second door on the left," Mads said. "Hurry up, Dad. We've got a conference call." I closed the bathroom door and locked it. It was a cavern of marble and gold fixtures. I didn't waste a second. I stepped over to the toilet and reached behind the porcelain tank. This was a classic spot, but for a reason. The acoustics in a bathroom are excellent for picking up voices in the adjacent rooms. And people often talk most freely while the water is running or right after. They think they are alone. I pressed the second device behind the heavy tank, well above the waterline. I flushed the toilet to mask sound, waited a beat, and then washed my hands. When I walked back out, I put on my best look of frail exhaustion. "I think I should go," I said, not looking them in the eye. "I'll be ready on Wednesday." 10 a.m., you said? 10 a.m. sharp, Mads said, walking me to the door. He put a hand on my shoulder, and for a second, I thought he might feel a shred of remorse. But then he spoke. "It's for the best, Dad. Truly. You'll be much happier when you don't have to worry about the details anymore." "I'm sure I will," I replied. The drive back to Aarhus was a blur. I didn't go to my workshop. I went straight to the small, secure laptop I kept in my bedroom, the one that wasn't connected to any of my main accounts. I plugged in the receiver and put on my headphones. The software synced almost immediately. The audio was crystal clear. At first, there was only the sound of a door slamming and the clinking of glasses. Then, Fraser's voice cut through the static like a serrated blade. "Is he gone?" "Yeah," Mads replied. "I heard the heavy thud of him collapsing onto a sofa. God, that was painful. Watching him fumbling with those albums. I almost felt bad." "Don't start," Freya snapped. "We don't have time for your feelings, Mads. We're 48 hours away from the Malmo people coming for our heads. Do you think they'll care about your childhood photos when they're breaking your legs?" I froze. Malmo. Elias had been right. The debt wasn't just a business failure, it was a death sentence. I know, Mads groaned. 4 million euros. I still can't believe you burned through that much on a crypto sure thing, Freya. We were fine until you decided to play the market. We were never fine, she screamed. I heard a glass shatter. We were living on credit and your father's generosity. Now, shut up and look at the schedule. The transport is confirmed. They'll take him from the house straight to the harbour. Are you sure about the Faroe Islands? Mads's voice was lower now, shaking. It's so remote. If anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, Fraser said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. It's an unlicensed medical warehouse. Nobody goes there. The doctor, if you can call him that, will handle the sedation. A complication due to his failing heart and advanced dementia. It's perfect. We get him out of the house. The house sale covers the interest, and the insurance covers the principal. 8 million euros, Mads. We pay off Malmo and we have 4 million left over to start again in Spain. 8 million, Mads repeated, as if he were trying to convince himself. It's a lot of money. I didn't think it would come to this. It came to this the moment you realized your father is sitting on a gold mine he refuses to share, Freya said. He's 70, Mads. He's had his life. Now it's time for ours. I pulled the headphones off, the silence of my bedroom, suddenly feeling very cold. The logic was simple, brutal, and flawlessly executed. They weren't just stealing my house, they were harvesting me. They had mapped out my death with the same precision I used to map out a mechanical repair. The Faroe Islands. A warehouse. A needle in the arm while I was too drugged to know who was killing me. All to pay for a model's bad bets and a son's cowardice. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of Aarhus were flickering in the dark. My son thought he was the one making the arrangements. He thought he was the one in control of the clock. He didn't know that the 48 hours he had given me were exactly what I needed. I didn't need to run. I didn't even need to hide. I just needed to move the pieces of their debt until the weight of it crushed them instead of me. I looked at the phone. It was time to call Elias again. But I wasn't going to ask for an audit this time. I was going to give an order. Every structure has a load-bearing point, I whispered to the dark room. Mads and Fraser had built their entire plan on the foundation of my weakness. They had assumed that because I was old, I was irrelevant. They had assumed that because I was quiet, I was defenseless. They were about to find out that the most dangerous part of any machine isn't the gears you can see moving. It's the tension held in the springs you've forgotten are even there. I picked up the pen and began to write down the names I had heard. Malmo, the debt, the insurance, the Faroe Islands. I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The betrayal was complete. The grieving was over. Now there was only the work. I went back to the workshop one last time that night. I didn't touch the clocks. I just sat there in the dark, surrounded by the tools of my trade, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a dozen different timepieces. In 46 hours, my son would come to this door to take me to my grave. I decided then that I wouldn't be there as a victim. I would be there as his landlord, his creditor, and his judge. The game they were playing was for 8 million euros. They had no idea I was playing for 120 million. And in that game, I owned the board, the pieces, and the very air they breathed. I sat in the darkness of my study, the only light coming from the glowing green indicator on the recording device I had retrieved from Mads's apartment. The voices of my son and his wife played on a loop in my head, a rhythmic percussion of betrayal. An accidental death, Freya had said. A warehouse in the Faroe Islands. They were talking about me as if I were a piece of old equipment that had become too expensive to maintain. A liability to be liquidated. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. I didn't turn on the lamps. I didn't need to see the walls of this house anymore. They were already gone in the eyes of the law, signed away by a pen I never held. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar ache in my joints, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. When you are 70 and the world decides you are obsolete, you either crumble or you become something else entirely. I chose the latter. I reached for my secure phone and dialed Elias Holm. He answered on the second ring. "Lucas, I've been waiting for your call," Elias said. His voice was steady, the sound of a man who moved millions across borders without breaking a sweat. "I heard everything, Elias," I said, my voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The Faroe Islands, the insurance policy, they aren't just looking for a way out of their debt, they're looking for a way to profit from my ending. I'm sorry, Lucas. Truly." "No father should have to hear that," he replied. "What is the move? Do we go to the authorities?" I have the Greenland logs ready. I have the bank statements showing the 75,000 euros being diverted to Mads's account. It's an open and shut case of elder abuse and fraud. I looked out the window at the Aarhus night. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows across the gravel. If I called the police, Mads and Freya would go to prison. There would be a trial, a scandal, and perhaps, in a few years, they would be paroled, still bitter, still looking for a score. It was too simple. It didn't account for the 4 million euros they owed to the people in Malmö. No police. Not yet, I said. If we put them in jail, the gang in Sweden still has a claim on them. Those people don't care about Danish law. They'll wait. I want to solve this permanently. I want to be the only person they have to answer to. What are you suggesting? Elias asked, though I could hear the gears turning in his head. He knew me. He knew I didn't believe in half measures. You told me they owe 4 million euros to a private group in Malmö, I said. High interest, past due, and the pressure is mounting. Who exactly holds those notes? A shell company called Nordisk Credit Solutions, Elias said. They're a front for a heavy-set operation out of the Malmö docks. They don't do credit scores, Lucas. They do collateral and consequences. I want you to buy it, I said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Elias adjusting his glasses. You want to buy 4 million euros of bad debt. Debt that is held by criminals. I have 120 million euros in that trust, Elias, I reminded him. 4 million is the price of a small boat. I want you to contact Nordisk Credit. Tell them a private investor wants to acquire the Jensen Fraser portfolio in its entirety. Offer them the full principal plus a 10% premium for a quick, cash-settled transfer. No questions, no delays. I want those promissory notes, the loan agreements, and the titles they're holding as collateral. I want it all in my name by tomorrow morning. Lucas, this is unconventional, Elias whispered. You're becoming their creditor. You'll own their apartment, their cars, and essentially their freedom. I'll own their lives, I corrected him. They wanted to sell mine for 8 million. I'm buying theirs for 4. It's a bargain. And the gang. They just want their money, Elias. They don't want the headache of chasing a fund manager and a model across Europe. Give them the cash, and they'll disappear. They'll be happy to walk away with a profit and let me handle the collection. I'll start the process immediately, Elias said, his voice regaining its professional clip. I can have the funds moved through the Luxembourg accounts and reach their representatives in Malmö within the hour. Digital signatures can be finalized before dawn. Good, I said. And, Elias, I need one more thing. I need a pair of special investigators. Not police, but people who know how to handle a crime scene and secure evidence. I want them at my house on Wednesday morning at 9:30. Dress them in suits. They should look like federal agents. I'll handle it. Is there anything else? Just the suit, I said, looking at the closet where my old tailor-made Italian wool suit hung, untouched since Astrid's funeral. I need to look the part of a man who still has everything. After I hung up, I sat in the stillness. The cold logic of the plan felt like a heavy coat, protecting me from the emotional wreckage of the day. I thought back to the stove in the kitchen, the hissing gas, and the way Mads had looked at me with that rehearsed pity. He had been willing to kill the man who gave him everything just to pay for a few more months of a life he couldn't afford. I opened my laptop and began to watch the transfer. In the world of high finance, things move with a silence that is terrifying. 4 million euros left a bank in Luxembourg, bounced through a clearinghouse in Stockholm, and landed in a secure account in Malmö. It took less than 20 minutes. A notification popped up on my screen, a secure file transfer from Elias. I opened The document, it was a digital scan of a promissory note signed by Mads Jensen and Fraser Jensen. Below it were the titles to their penthouse in Aarhus and their luxury SUV. In the eyes of the Swedish group, these were just pieces of paper they were happy to trade for liquid cash. To me, they were the bars of a cage. I officially became my son's master at 2:14 a.m. I stood up and walked to the workshop. I didn't pick up any tools. I just stood among the clocks, listening to them. For years, I had maintained them, making sure they kept perfect time. Now, the timing was entirely mine. Mads and Fraser were still sleeping in their expensive bed, probably dreaming of the Faroe Islands and the 8 million euros they thought was coming their way. They had no idea that their debt had changed hands. They had no idea that the confused old man they were planning to discard now owned every brick over their heads and every cent in their pockets. I thought about the money. 120 million euros. It was a staggering amount, a legacy of Astrid's family that I had guarded like a silent sentinel. I had never wanted a flashy life. I liked my old house, my workshop, and my quiet routines. But money, in this volume, isn't for spending. It's for leverage. It's a force of nature. The morning in Aarhus was cold, the kind of damp chill that settles into your bones and stays there regardless of how many layers you wear. I sat in my workshop, the small room at the back of the house where the light was best, hunched over a 19th century pendulum clock. It was a delicate piece of machinery, a complex heart of brass and steel that required a steady hand and an even steadier mind. At 70, my hands were still reliable, a trait I had cultivated through decades of precision. The silence of the house was my companion. Since Astrid passed away, the quiet wasn't a burden, it was a choice. I lived simply, surrounded by the ghosts of memories rather than people. And that was exactly how I liked it. But that morning, the silence was shattered. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway was aggressive. It wasn't the mailman or the occasional delivery. This was the sound of a heavy engine, something expensive and out of place in this quiet neighborhood. I didn't get up immediately. I finished setting a tiny gear into place, making sure the teeth aligned perfectly. Only then did I set down my loop and walk toward the front of the house. Standing on my porch were two people who looked like they had been airdropped from a different world. One was Fraser, my son's new wife. She was a model, or so she said, and she carried herself with a staged elegance that felt like a thin veneer over something much sharper. Beside her was a man in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He held a leather briefcase like a weapon. "Lucas," Freya said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She didn't step inside, even though the wind was picking up. "I believe you know Søren Moller." I knew the name. Moller was a lawyer known for handling difficult transitions for wealthy families. He wasn't the kind of man you invited for coffee. "It's a bit early for a social call, Fraser," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Where's Mads?" "Mads is busy," she snapped. "He's handling the business side of things. We're just here to deliver the paperwork." Moller stepped forward, opening his briefcase with a practiced click. He pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to me. "Mr. Jensen, I'll get straight to the point. The property at this address has been officially transferred. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." I felt a dull thud in my chest, not of fear, but of profound confusion. "Transferred? This house has been in my family for 40 years. It's paid for. I don't owe anyone a dime." "Not anymore," Moller said, his eyes as cold as the North Sea. "A power of attorney was executed last month, giving your son full authority over your assets. He has seen fit to sell the property to a private holding group. The sale was finalized yesterday. By 10 a.m. Wednesday, you need to be out. Any personal belongings left behind will be disposed of. I looked at the envelope in my hand. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. I didn't explode. I didn't shout. That isn't my way. I simply opened the flap and pulled out the top sheet. It was a power of attorney form. At the bottom, in the space for the grantor, was my signature. It was perfect. The slight tilt of the L, the way the J looped back on itself. It was a flawless imitation, but I knew I hadn't signed it. I was in Greenland last month, I said quietly, looking up at them. I was in the Ilulissat Icefjords for 3 weeks. There's no way I signed this in Aarhus on the 12th. Fraser let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Oh, Lucas, this is exactly what Mads was worried about. Your memory is failing. You're confused. You signed those papers right here in the kitchen before we left for the honeymoon. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She looked at me, not with pity, but with a predatory hunger. She wanted me gone. She wanted the money. And for some reason, she was in a desperate hurry. 48 hours, Moller repeated, clicking his briefcase shut. We'll have a crew here at 10 o'clock sharp on Wednesday. I suggest you start packing, Mr. Jensen. They turned and walked back to their gleaming black SUV without another word. I watched them drive away, the red glow of their taillights disappearing around the bend. I stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at my face, clutching the papers that claimed I was no longer the master of my own life. I went back inside and locked the door. The house felt different now. It felt like a trap. I walked to my study, a small room lined with books and old files. In the corner sat a heavy oak filing cabinet. I reached into my pocket for my keychain and pulled out a small silver key. I only had 2 copies of this key. One was on my ring. The other was hidden in a spare key box in the garage, a location only Mads knew about. I opened the bottom drawer. The file for the house was there, but the folder labeled Legal Personal was slightly misaligned. I pulled it out. My original documents were gone. In their place were photocopies. The realization hit me with a cold, clinical clarity. Mads hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't been talked into this by Freya. He had actively sought out the key, stolen my identity, and forged my hand. My own son, the boy I had raised, the man I had supported through every failed venture and bad decision, was now trying to discard me like a piece of broken furniture. I sat down at my desk. The forged document spread out before me. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man who had been given a problem to solve. I had spent 40 years dealing with complex systems, finding the weak points in structures and ensuring that everything stayed upright. I picked up a pen, but I didn't sign anything. Instead, I began to make a list. First, the money. I checked my bank balance on my laptop, my primary retirement account, which should have held 75,000 euros. My cushion for the next few years was at 0. Transferred 2 days ago. Second, the motivation. Mads was a fund manager, or at least he held the title. He lived a life of high-end suits and expensive watches, but I knew the industry. He was a gambler, always looking for the next big score. If he was stealing from his own father, he wasn't just greedy. He was desperate. Third, the counter-move. They thought I was a tired old man who would go quietly into a government-run care home. They thought my only worth was this house and the small change in my bank account. What they didn't know, what even Mads didn't know, was that I had been keeping a secret for 20 years. When Astrid's father passed away, he didn't leave his wealth to a flashy foundation or a public trust. He left it to me in a private fund based in Luxembourg, tucked away behind layers of legal protection that Mads couldn't even dream of navigating. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon. I had 46 hours left. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. It didn't go to an office. It went to a private line in Copenhagen. "Elias," I said when the voice answered. "Lucas? It's been years. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "I need to activate the trust, all of it. I need a full audit of every debt held by a man named Mads Jensen and his wife, Freya. And I need it by tonight. That's a significant move, Lucas. Are you sure? They want to take my home, Elias. They want to tell the world I've lost my mind." I looked at the forged signature one last time before ripping the paper in half. They want to play a game of numbers. Fine. Let's show them what real numbers look like. I hung up the phone and walked back to my workshop. I picked up the pendulum clock. It was still ticking, a rhythmic, relentless sound. Time was moving, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just watching it pass. I was counting it. The betrayal hurt, yes, a deep, hollow ache in the center of my chest. But beneath that was something else, a cold, hard spark of anger that I hadn't felt in decades. Mads had forgotten who I was before I became his retired father. He had forgotten that you don't survive 70 years in this world by being soft. I set the clock back on the table. It was perfectly calibrated. Now, it was time to calibrate my son's future. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing a single small suitcase. I didn't take much, just clothes, a few photos of Astrid, and my tools. I didn't need the furniture. I didn't need the memories attached to the walls. As the sun began to set over Aarhus, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn, I sat by the window and waited. I knew Mads would call. He wouldn't be able to help himself. He'd want to check on his confused father, to play the role of the concerned son one last time before the hammer fell. When the phone finally buzzed on the table, I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. "Hello, Mads," I said. "Dad? Hey, Freya told me she stopped by. I'm so sorry about all this, really. I wanted to tell you myself, but things have been so crazy at the firm." His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who believed his own lies. "You sold the house, Mads," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I had to, Dad. Your health, that incident with the stove last month, it scared us. We just want you to be somewhere safe, where people can look after you. We've found a great place, very exclusive." The stove. I remembered that day. I had been in the workshop, and when I came back into the kitchen, the gas was hissing, the burner unlit. I had assumed I'd bumped it. Now I realized how convenient that accident had been. "I see," I said. "And the 75,000 euros. There was a brief pause. "That's for the deposit at the care facility. It's expensive, Dad, but you're worth it." I almost smiled. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. If I hadn't known better, I might have even believed he cared. 48 hours, Mads. That's not a lot of time for an old man to move. "Don't worry about the heavy lifting," he said, his voice brimming with false cheer. "We'll handle everything. Just be ready on Wednesday. We love you, Dad." He hung up. I put the phone down and looked out at the darkening garden. He had no idea. He was so focused on the small prize, this house, my meager savings, that he couldn't see the mountain moving toward him. He thought he was the hunter. He thought I was the prey. He was about to find out that in a world governed by precision, a single misplaced gear can bring the entire machine screaming to a halt. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat in my chair, watching the clock, waiting for the first report from Elias. The game had started, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. The 48-hour countdown wasn't my deadline. It was theirs. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I didn't pack much. I didn't need to. By 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, this house wouldn't be mine, but I would be far from homeless. As the first grey light of Tuesday morning began to bleed through the curtains, I felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal no longer burned. It had turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. I had raised a man who thought he could outmaneuver me, a man who thought aging was the same as weakening. I looked at the forged power of attorney one last time. It was a pathetic piece of work compared to the documents I now held. 48 hours, I whispered. Wednesday was coming. Mads would arrive with his lawyer and his fake smiles, ready to take me to the care facility. He would expect to find a broken man waiting on a suitcase. Instead, he was going to find a man who had already dismantled his world from the inside out. He was going to find the creditor he couldn't pay, the father he couldn't kill, and the architect of a ruin he never saw coming. I went to the kitchen and made a fresh pot of coffee. The gas ignited perfectly on the first click. No hissing, no accidents, just a steady, controlled flame. I sat at the table and watched the sun rise over Aarhus, waiting for the final countdown to begin. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the ghost in their machine, and I was about to turn the gears until they snapped. Wednesday morning in Aarhus arrived with a sharp, clear sunlight that felt like a spotlight. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the lapels of my Italian wool suit. It was a heavy, expensive fabric that felt like armor. For the last 48 hours, I had played the part of a crumbling man. I had slumped my shoulders, let my voice tremble, and watched as my own son measured my life in insurance payouts. But as the clock on the wall neared 10, the performance ended. Beside me stood Elias Holm. He looked exactly as a man managing a €120 million trust should. Calm, precise, and utterly immovable. Behind him, in the shadows of the dining room, were two men in dark suits I had hired through Elias's network. They weren't police. Not yet, but they had the cold, clinical look of federal investigators who had seen every flavor of human greed. The sound of the black SUV pulling into the gravel driveway was the final cue. I checked my watch. 10 a.m. sharp. Mads was always punctual when there was a profit to be made. The front door opened without a knock. Mads stepped in first, followed by Freyja, and that vulture of a lawyer, Søren Moller. Mads was wearing a look of rehearsed sorrow, his hands tucked into his pockets. Freyja looked around the foyer as if she were already picking out new wallpaper. "Dad," Mads called out, his voice pitched in that high, false tone of concern. "We're here. The car is waiting to take you to the new place. It's a beautiful drive, really." I walked out from the study and met them in the center of the hallway. I didn't slump. I stood tall, my hands clasped behind my back. The sight of me in the suit stopped them mid-stride. Mads's eyes widened, flitting from my face to Elias, and then to the two men standing silently in the dining room. "What is this, Lukas?" Søren Moller asked, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "You were supposed to have your bags packed. We have a legal transfer to execute." "The only thing being executed today, Søren, is justice," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a man who had spent decades ensuring every gear and lever in a machine worked exactly as intended. "Dad, don't be difficult," Mads said, stepping forward. "You're confused. You've been having these episodes. We talked about this. The house is sold. The papers are signed." "Let's talk about those papers," I said, nodding to Elias. Elias stepped forward and laid a folder on the antique side table. "This is a power of attorney document dated December 12th, Elias said, "signed by Lukas Jensen in Aarhus. Isn't that right, Mr. Moller?" "That is correct," Moller snapped. "I witnessed it myself." "That's interesting," I said, pulling a stack of photographs and a tablet from the folder. Because on December 12th, I was sitting on a red fishing boat in the Ilulissat ice fjord in Greenland. I was 3,000 kilometers away from Aarhus, in a place where the only witnesses were the icebergs and a local guide named Malik. I turned the tablet around. It showed a high-resolution photo of me holding a local newspaper from that day, with the massive glaciers of Greenland in the background. I have the flight receipts, the satellite phone logs, and Malik's sworn statement. I couldn't have signed your paper, Søren, unless I can be in two places at once. And since we both know I'm not a magician, that leaves us with a very ugly word: forgery. Mads's face turned a sickly shade of grey. Frasier stepped back, her hand going to her throat. It must be a mistake in the date, she stammered. There are no mistakes here, I said. Only choices. I reached over and pressed play on a small digital recorder sitting on the table. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of Frejar's voice, clear and cold. It's an unlicensed medical warehouse. Nobody goes there. The doctor will handle the sedation. 8 million euros, Mads. We pay off Malmö and we have 4 million left over. The recording played for another 30 seconds. The sound of my son agreeing to my murder in a warehouse in the Faroe Islands. The silence that followed was deafening. Mads looked like he was about to vomit. Frasier was shaking, her eyes darting toward the door. You're recording us, Mads whispered, his voice cracking. Dad, we were just stressed. We didn't mean it. You meant every word, I said. You saw an old man and you thought you saw a bank account with a heartbeat. You thought my life was worth 8 million euros. You were wrong. It's worth much more. Lucas, listen, Mola began, his voice desperate now. We can settle this. We can void the transfer. It's already settled, I interrupted. I looked at Mads. I know about the 4 million euros you owe to the group in Malmö. I know about the crypto losses and the threats against your life. How do you know that? Mads gasped. Because I bought it, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. As of 2 o'clock yesterday morning, I am the sole owner of your debt. I didn't just buy the notes, Mads. I bought the titles to your apartment and your cars. I own the chair you sit in and the air you breathe. Mads collapsed against the wall, his legs finally giving out. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. You have that kind of money? I have 120 million euros in a trust your mother left for me, I said. I lived simply because I didn't need the flash. I wanted to see if you would become a man on your own. Instead, you became a predator. I looked at the two men in the dining room. I gave a slight nod. They stepped forward, and I saw the gleam of handcuffs. Real police officers who had been waiting outside entered the house at that moment. Mads Jensen, Freya Jensen, and Søren Moller. One of the officers said, "You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder." As the officers moved in, Mads began to sob. He reached out toward me, his face a mask of snot and tears. "Dad, please, I'm your son, you can't do this." I looked down at him. I felt a flicker of the old love, the memory of a small boy holding my hand, but it was quickly extinguished by the sound of his voice on that recording. My son died the moment he decided I was a payout, Mads. To me, you're just a bad investment I'm writing off. They were led out in silence, save for Mads's muffled cries and Frija's sharp protests. The gravel crunched under the tires of the police cars as they drove away, leaving the house in a silence that was finally truly peaceful. Elias stood beside me. "What now, Lucas? The house is yours again. The debt is settled." I looked around the foyer. This house was full of Astrid, but it was also full of the rot my son had brought into it. I didn't want to live in a museum of betrayal. "Sell it," I said. "Sell everything. Give the proceeds to a charity for the elderly. I'm done with this place." "And where will you go?" I thought about the glaciers in Greenland, the vast, open silence of the north. Somewhere new. Somewhere where the air is clean and the clocks don't matter. I walked out of the front door and down the steps. A sleek, silver sedan was waiting for me. I didn't look back at the villa. I had spent 70 years building things, making sure the foundations were strong. I had one last project left: myself. As the car pulled away from the curb, I realized that the secret wasn't the $90 million or the 120 million euros. The secret was knowing that your worth isn't in what you own, but in what you're willing to defend. This story serves as a stark reminder: never mistake kindness for weakness, and never assume that the elderly are silent because they have nothing to say. Respect is earned, but betrayal has a price that even the deepest pockets cannot always pay. Protect your legacy, but more importantly, protect your soul. Thank you for following this journey of justice and redemption. If you found Lucas's story powerful, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the secrets people keep. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible stories to life. See you in the next one.